been such a fun day. The first thing I want to acknowledge is that you guys have been sitting with us for a long time now. You spent a good number of hours with us this afternoon, and I just want to thank you for staying tuned. I know that it can be difficult to talk about some of these things, and maybe there's some really wonderful things that have come out of this so far for you. But yes, my name is Tamera, and I am a local clinician here in Pearland, and I have been serving families for many years. But first and foremost, I'm part of a family. I've been married long enough and have enough kids that I am familiar with so many of the different struggles that exist with being in a marriage, raising kids, and just managing day-to-day life. So aside from all of these credentials, what really counts is personal experience a lot of times, is knowing that I am just a human like you are. So I have the pleasure and also the difficult task of talking to you about mental health. Mental health is something that we hear a lot about, especially because of coronavirus. It's been in the news a lot more recently, and not for good reasons. But it also is something that deeply affects marriages. And my goal today is to share with you some information. So this is more of an informational session. So before you shut it down, and if you think that maybe this doesn't apply to you, I want to encourage you to stay tuned. Because the reality is that you know someone. You most definitely have someone in your life or in your family who is struggling with these things, and some of the information I'm going to give you today might actually help you with that. I want to start with a really important verse from the Bible that's been very encouraging for me, and it is from Psalms 147:3. It says, "He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds." This is especially significant for me because mental illness is not just something that I do for a living. It's something that's touched me very personally and deeply in my own life. I'd like to introduce you to my father. He is a handsome man. He was a charismatic man, very talented, very smart, but he had an invisible disability that took his life exactly 1 year and 2 days ago. So 1 year and 2 days ago, when my father died, my passion to understand and to seek out resources, information, and to develop strategies to help people was just exacerbated tenfold. Losing him was one of the most difficult things I've ever done in my life, and I'd like to share a little bit of his story with you. So I said it was an invisible disability, and the reality is that most mental illness is. You can't see it. You see someone who has a missing arm or a leg, there's an automatic translation in your mind that maybe they need additional services or support, or there's something going on with them anyway. You can see that. But with mental illness, it's a different kind of thing. Oftentimes, people who suffer with various disorders walk around and they look just like you or me. They often talk just like you or me. We're married to them. They're our children. They're our aunts, uncles, grandparents. And my dad was no different. He had a lot of capabilities, but unfortunately, he was so unstable that he was never able to really realize any true success in his life. I remember when I was graduating with my first degree in college, I remember sitting in my mom's driveway and I was making phone calls. I hadn't heard from or seen my dad in probably several years at that point. I'd completely lost touch with him. And I was desperate, a 23-year-old kid graduating from college, super excited, really wanted to share it with my dad. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to find him. And I remember sitting on my graduation day in the row, waiting for them to call my name, wondering if my dad was dead. And if any of you have ever felt that before, have ever loved someone who struggled with mental illness, homelessness, substance abuse, you know what I'm feeling, you know what I'm talking about. But besides the fact that he was my father, he was my mother's husband. He was the patriarch of our home at one time. And so as you can imagine, someone who's as unstable as that really struggled to maintain a family, and it's not something I ever experienced. And so while I'm speaking as a daughter and speaking as a clinician, I'm also speaking into marriage because my dad was a husband, and his mental illness made it extremely difficult for him to carry on a meaningful life with his family. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what the signs of mental illness are. We keep throwing the word around. We talk about mental health, but I feel like sometimes we might have an inkling There's something inside of us that says that maybe something's not quite right. There are some things that are easily seen than others, but oftentimes we don't really know what we're looking for, and that's where the real tragedy begins. Because when we don't know what we're looking for, we don't know what to do about it. So the first thing that I'll mention as far as marriage is that maybe you've come to several of these. You've been to lots of marriage conferences, maybe you've read books, blogs, you've done it all, and you feel like the advice just does not apply. That what's happening with your spouse, it just doesn't fit. You've tried all those things, and it doesn't seem to do any good. That's one of the very first signs. Carol talked about this. She talked about, self-reflection, the ability to self-reflect, and Kurt talked about selfishness. When we talk about mental illness, those are often two inherent things in that, and so it's very difficult to make progress whenever there is mental illness in tow, and so the advice, it just doesn't stick and it doesn't apply. There's no awareness of problem behaviors. So if your spouse engages in behaviors and you call them out on it and they don't seem to notice, they don't seem to recognize that what they're doing is inappropriate or making other people uncomfortable, that would be a sign. If other people are starting to ask questions, other people notice before you or your spouse do, they might say things like, hey, are you aware that your husband or your wife said this and it feels really uncomfortable? If other people start noticing and making comments or asking you questions like, how are things going? How are you guys doing? There's just some things, because obviously we're pretty careful in our society not to ask the wrong questions or make anyone uncomfortable, but if people have started to approach you, that's also a sign. Everyone around you says there's an issue, but you disagree with them and you don't see it. So you might have multiple people in your family, you might have friends, you might have people in your community group who have approached you and said, hey, this thing that you're doing or this thing that your spouse is doing is not okay, or it makes us uncomfortable. That would be a sign as well that there's something possibly going on. There are a lot of circular issues. Seems like you've addressed the same problems over and over and over again, and there's no resolution to them. That's also another sign, and that goes back to that same self-reflection and problem-solving ability that we've talked about throughout the conference. Anxiety, if there's anxiety present where it interferes with day-to-day life, maybe there's anxiety about having people over or going places or doing things, that could be a sign. Depression. Depression looks different for different people. For some people, it causes withdrawal. Maybe it's difficult to shower, On any given day, a normal person might not have any issue getting up and taking a shower, but if there's some depression present, maybe that's really laborious and maybe something they might avoid, or they're just more withdrawn, reluctant to engage in activities like normal. You see a stark difference in their level of joy and engagement in the family. Avoidance. This is another big one. If there are issues and there are things that are going on, you might find that person in your life or you are avoiding things. You're just really you're very reluctant to engage in a conversation about what's going on and how things have been going. There's self-medication with alcohol. This is a big one. And this one tends to creep up a lot of times. If there's depression or anxiety, and maybe at one time you and your spouse enjoyed a drink now and then, maybe socially, but suddenly you're starting to see that drinking is ramping up a little bit. Now it's like, oh, we drink because it was a long day. We drink because it was a hard day. We drink just because it's Tuesday. And we start to see a pattern. And oftentimes we brush that off because in our society, having a drink every day is not perceived as a big deal. But you know yourself and you know your spouse, and it can become pretty easy to recognize when you're really paying attention if that drinking is more of a self-medicating act than it is really something that's healthy or normal. Substance abuse, popping pills, using other drugs recreationally, that's also a sign of self-medication and possible mental illness. The next one is a topic that we hear a lot about when it comes to kids, and we've heard a lot about it when it comes to COVID, the incidence of suicidality. So suicidality is a number of things. It can be comprised of actually attempting suicide, completion of suicide, which isn't really what we're focusing on now, but threatening suicide, talking about, I want to die. If they get upset with you, they might threaten to kill themselves. They might actually self-harm in some way. That would be considered signs of mental illness as well. Also, sexual abuse. So if your spouse is coercing you, is threatening you, is forcibly placing themselves on you for any reason, that would be considered sexual abuse, which is a sign of mental illness. Emotional and physical abuse are also things. And this is kind of a gray area. Sometimes we're not really sure, what does that mean? So how do I know if I'm being emotionally abused? How do I know if I'm being spiritually abused? We know if we're being physically abused, someone's hitting us, they're hurting us physically. But emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, and psychological abuse can be a little bit harder to identify. But one of the best ways I can describe it to you to start with is just think about, am I uncomfortable? Do I feel safe? Am I watching what I'm saying? Am I fearful of my spouse's response to what I'm saying? Or if you're on the other end of that and you recognize that maybe you tend to be volatile or manipulative, or you get upset when your spouse says certain things, that could be a warning sign for you to take a look at. The last thing that I want to talk about is genetics. It runs in the family. This is a hard thing, right? Because I told you my dad's story. My dad struggled with mental illness. And so of course that means that my propensity to be mentally ill or have struggles with mental illness is higher because of my father's disability. The same is true for all of us. Mental illness is something that we've determined is about 75% genetic. So that means 75% of our genetics our personality, our tendencies are from our genetics. Only about 25% of them come from our environment, which means that if certain things happen in our environment and we're already likely to develop those things naturally by our genetics, then we're more likely to develop those things. Now, I don't want you to feel doomed, because there are certainly a lot of us who have mental illness in our families, and either by our own, workings, we work hard at it, we learn things, we get treatment, maybe we got lucky and we didn't develop that. Our genetics came from a grandparent or someone else in our family, but it is something to be aware of. So if you see a pattern in your spouse's family, just know that it's something to look at, that if those things kind of collide and some of these other things are present, it's something to look at. Why is this so important? And also, why is it so stigmatized? And I ask that question because 1 in 5 adults have a mental illness. That's a pretty glaring statistic if you ask me, especially when we're not talking about it much. So if you think about, if you're in a room with 20 people, at least 4, I can't do math very well, of those people are likely to have mental illness. And most definitely everybody in the room is going to know someone, because we all know at least 5 people. I'm sure you know at least 5 people, I know at least 5 people. And so the reality is that it is prevalent. It is something that is all around us. We can't deny it. It's a factor in our day-to-day lives. People we work with, people we love, it's everywhere. So what exactly is it? So I'm going to read this definition for you. This is the clinical definition of what mental illness is. So it's considered to be a broad range of medical conditions such as major depression, schizophrenia, or obsessive compulsive disorder that cause a significant disorganization of personality, mind, or emotions that impair normal psychological functioning. This impairment causes distress or disability that disrupts normal thinking, feeling, mood, behavior, interpersonal interactions, or daily functioning. So that's a lot to say, but essentially what it means is when you're disturbed in the mind, whenever you're emotionally unstable, when you feel like you are all over the place, when you struggle with interpersonal relationships, you struggle with anger, you struggle with sadness, that affects your life. And so essentially it's any kind of mental condition that affects your daily life. If you are not being true to who you are, and you are being affected and your family dynamics are being affected by any kind of mental struggle, then that would be considered a mental illness. So here's where we talk about how does this occur. So we did talk about nature versus nurture. We said that we do have a propensity because of our genetics if it runs in our family. But we also have to consider our environment. So if we're in an environment where we experience trauma, where bad things have happened to us or around us, that can definitely impact our ability to function. And so when we get married and we say I do on that wedding day, we're often not thinking about and looking at who we were before we got to that moment. So when we're looking at our spouse, we're not seeing all the struggles they've been through. We're not seeing their childhood. We're not seeing their genetics. We're seeing them. And that's beautiful, but it's also a little bit short-sighted because all the things I just mentioned make up part of who they are. So trauma is a significant factor in mental illness. If we have experienced things, it's very difficult without treatment for us to come into a marriage, to come into a parenting situation, and not bring those things with us. Personality disorders. Personality disorders are something that we don't talk about a whole lot, even in my field. I am a certified personality disorder specialist, so I do work in this area, and I'm very passionate about it because it's what my father had. So personality disorders, you might hear people throw around terms like narcissistic or histrionic. You might have heard these words before, but not really realize that they were associated with genuine disorders, invisible disabilities. These are people, some of the most famous people on the planet, some of the most successful people on the planet have been known to have personality disorders. And the reality is what they're characterized by is psychological inflexibility and a lack of problem-solving skills. So they have a really hard time recognizing other people's needs and emotions. They tend to be unempathetic. They tend to be fairly self-centered, even in their distress. Even if they are distressed or they're very needy, they tend to struggle with this. And so we see lots and lots and lots of people who are in marriages who have personality disorders. And in my many years of working particularly with contentious divorce, speaking about marriage again, it is not uncommon for me to identify that in most cases, there is at least one person in that marriage that is suffering from an undiagnosed personality disorder. Bipolar, major depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, eating disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. Some of these might be new for you, but these are all things that are fairly common. So we've heard a lot more about PTSD recently because of the war and because of the effect that it's had on soldiers. But what we don't realize is that post-traumatic stress is not isolated just for soldiers. I mean, people experience post-traumatic stress for a lot of reasons. Even thinking about people who've been divorced and gotten remarried, they may actually carry some of that post-traumatic stress from their first marriage into their second marriage or third marriage, and it's really impacting the way that relationship is playing out. They just don't realize it. So let's talk about the impact that mental illness has on marriage specifically. So mental illness increases the likelihood of divorce by up to 80%. I'm going to say that again. Mental illness increases the likelihood of divorce by up to 80%. So if you think about this, you think about, if a couple gets married and they're not aware, or maybe the illness progresses over time and it becomes more and more difficult to manage, the likelihood of them ending in divorce is 80%. That's way too close to 100% if you ask me. And I'll be honest with you, that's why we're here today. That's why we're having this hard conversation. And I just want to acknowledge right now that you might be uncomfortable. You might feel a little bit unsure of even watching this, or maybe a little depressed, to be honest. But I'm glad you feel that way because it is uncomfortable. But suffering with mental illness and suffering in a marriage where mental illness exists is extremely uncomfortable. And if we don't start talking about it, this number, it's not going to have any chance of going down. Because I'm going to tell you right now that the vast majority of these marriages in this statistic more than likely didn't have any intervention. So why does it cause divorce? Why does this happen? The biggest thing is fear and stigma. So that uncomfortable feeling that you might be having is more than likely coming from fear and stigma. We live in a culture that while we acknowledge that there are mental illness issues, we have a massive homeless population. We have massive amounts of suicides every year. We have serious domestic violence cases and child abuse cases all over the country. All you have to do is click on the news and you'll read about it. But it's still so stigmatized. People are reluctant to say, hey, I'm really struggling with this. I'm hitting my wife, or I'm screaming at her, or maybe she's screaming at him. There's abuse in the home. It's terrifying because we don't want to be stigmatized. Nobody wants to be that couple that has those issues because a lot of times that uncomfortable feeling that we have gets passed on to them. We don't know how to support them. We don't know what to do about it, and so we just avoid it. So fear and stigma is definitely on the top of my list. Oftentimes, Couples who are struggling with mental illness, people who are struggling with mental illness, they are the last to get help. Because of that fear and stigma we're talking about, because they don't feel normal, they tend to avoid getting help until pretty much the very end. We also have a prolonged history of trauma in that relationship. So you figure if they're the last to get help, then that means they've probably been suffering for a really long time, silently, not saying anything, trying to hide it. They typically start to come for services or help when they feel out of control. Things just feel like so out of control. And I'm going to say it's really tough because, again, a lot of times there's not an acknowledgement or understanding that there really is mental illness that's involved, and that it's not just that person's fault. They're not just a jerk. They're not just a depressed lump on a log. You're not married to Eeyore. This person genuinely may not have the capacity, ability to reflect and understand that there's something going on with them that's beyond their control. And prayer goes a really long ways, but God has equipped people with passions and abilities to support those who are struggling in a way that they need, that there's no other means of getting that kind of recovery. Resentment. There's a lot of resentment in these marriages. There's probably a lot of pain, a lot of hurt, a lot of violations that have occurred over time. And so you may have, both spouses, the one who struggles to self-reflect and recognize that they've hurt the other, who's resentful because they can't do anything right. And then you have the spouse on the other end who's just resentful because they feel like they're not loved, they married the wrong person, they made a mistake. All those kind of thoughts start to brood in the mind, kind of like that perception Carol was talking about earlier. Oftentimes it's a last-ditch effort, and they're coming to prove that it won't work. The proof that it's not help. I can't tell you how many people have come into my office and said, well, this is the last step. If this doesn't work, we're getting a divorce. And I can tell you right now, I can see it in the eyes. I've been doing this long enough that I can recognize they've already decided. The hurt is too deep. The decision's been made. The perspective is nothing's going to work. And so really nothing I'm going to say or offer them is going to change that. So my goal in those situations is to work on changing the heart, that transformation that Kurt was talking about, allowing them an opportunity to take personal responsibility for the transformation that's required for them to press on and press forward into a healthier place in their relationship. Trauma in the relationship, there's been many violations. Maybe there's physical trauma, maybe there's such deep emotional trauma that it's difficult for them to overcome. Because again, going back to the top of the list, they've waited till the very end. They've waited till the last minute to get the help that they need. Infidelity is a big one. This has been talked about today. Trust, security, it's a deal breaker. And infidelity is a common and frequent aspect of mental illness because there's erratic behavior, there's lack of awareness, lack of problem-solving ability. And so we're seeking to get those needs met and that void to be filled outside the marriage. And there's hurt and there's pain. Like Kurt said, it's usually, the infidelity is not the beginning point. It comes after. It's after a long period of other things have been happened and not addressed that becomes an issue. And so it's a very difficult thing, not impossible. I have seen God deliver beautifully marriages that have struggled with this, but it is extremely difficult. The last thing that I'll mention is violence and abuse. As Kurt said earlier today, that's a deal breaker. When there is violence and abuse existing in a marriage, that is not a safe place. It is not a safe place, and it is not conducive to thriving. And unless and until those things are dealt with and managed, it is extremely difficult for a couple to have an opportunity to recover from the struggles that they are having. And so that leads us back to the why. Why is it that 80% of marriages that have mental illness end in divorce? I think you've got your answer. So let's talk now about the differences between where we are in our marriages, right? Like, when do we know that it's really not good, when it's really bad, and when is it just, we know we need a little bit of a pick-me-up, a little bit of oomph there. Most of us, all of us, find ourselves at least in the distressed marriage position at one time or another, but that's very different from a conflictual marriage. So a distressed marriage, there's anxiety, frustration, there's conflict. You aren't doing great. You're not feeling great. You got some things you know you need to work out. But the thing is, the key here is that there is self-reflection. There's the ability to recognize your needs, your spouse's needs. Both of you are kind of on the same page, recognizing that you need to take some steps towards healing your marriage. You also retain empathy. You have a lot of empathy for your spouse. You've maintained a secure attachment with them. You also have the ability to communicate. You know, you can say, yeah, I'm stressed. Yeah, I've been avoiding this, but at the end of the day, you have the ability to communicate about it. So when looking at a conflictual marriage, this is one where we need a higher level of intervention. This is where we experience malevolence, hatred towards one another. One spouse towards the other or both towards each other. That's a sure sign of a conflictual marriage. Coercive or threatening behavior. So if you're in a situation where your spouse is trying to coerce you or threaten you into having sex with them, into not talking to people, into doing certain things or meeting certain needs that they have, they're manipulating you, that is a sure sign of conflictual marriage. Blaming, accusations, paranoia, and withdrawal, these are also things to look for when you know that your marriage might be in a deeper place, that you need a little bit higher level of intervention. There's also insecure attachment. So I talked a bit about, abuse, trauma. When we've experienced those things, the word attachment is oftentimes associated with having kids. And we want our kids to have a secure attachment with us. But what we don't realize and what we don't talk a lot about is the fact that we as adults, we never lose our need to be securely attached to other people. We are wired for connection. God created us to be in community with each other. And when we are in a broken community, when we do not connect and we feel isolated and we are not safe, that is not a good place to be, especially in marriage. There is a psychiatric condition. So if you are in a situation where your spouse is suffering from a more psychiatric type illness, where they have paranoia and they act erratically or they do, scary things, unsafe things, and if they have a personality disorder. So I mentioned earlier that personality disorders are something that people are relatively unfamiliar with, excepting for when they want to make jokes about it. And I encourage people to be informed and understand that personality disorders affect about 15% of people. May not sound like a lot, but when you're really thinking about all the different mental illness and psychiatric conditions that are out there, 15% is a pretty high number. And that's only the ones that we know about, because remember, people aren't getting help until the very last minute. So we have a whole lot of people who might be struggling with these things, like my dad, who are none the wiser. They struggle their whole entire lives because they don't know what's wrong with them. It's so important for me, following all of this kind of bad news, really hard stuff to swallow and hear, with the reality that God is not lost on your suffering. He created us carefully, purposefully, and we are disordered. We are broken. We have issues. And God is not oblivious to this. He loves us even in our worst. I believe that that's part of the whole concept of the wedding vows, for better, for worse, because it really mirrors the relationship that God wants to have with us. And that's a really hard thing. If you're in a marriage where you are married to someone who is struggling with mental illness, it's hard to hear that because maybe you're so broken. You might be sitting on the other end of this camera and you feel like I've reached into your soul and I've just gutted you. If you feel like that, I want you to know that you are not alone. God hears you. He knows your struggle. He knows how difficult it is. If you are the person who recognizes you have hurt the people you love the most, if you recognize that maybe there's something not quite right about you and you are ashamed and you don't want to hurt them anymore, you're not alone either. He is with you. I'd like to share a verse from Isaiah. Isaiah 43:2. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. You might feel like you're on fire. Really, everything about your life is burning down. but you are not on fire. You only feel like you are because he's right there with you. It takes a village. We were not meant to do this alone. And I am now going to speak some to those of you who maybe you think, this doesn't apply to me. We're good. I'm so glad. Thank God we don't have this in our home. And I'm happy for you. But there's somebody in your life, someone in your community group, you might be friends with someone, and they're suffering. And maybe you've been avoiding having that hard conversation. Maybe you've talked badly about them behind their back because they've said and done things that are uncomfortable, annoying, off color. You're doing a disservice to your community. I want to share this verse with you from Galatians. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. We aren't supposed to just stay married when things are good. We're supposed to stay married even when they're not. And when we think about friendship, Kurt talked about friendship. You can trust that person's going to be there with you and be there for you, isn't going to abandon you. So when we say we're friends, when we say we're community, we need to be willing to carry each other's burdens, even with mental illness, you guys. And it's hard. It is hard to love people who are unlovable. But God said to love one another as I have loved you. Are we always lovable? Are we always perfect? We need to learn how to talk about these things, to be open about them, to be there for one another, because it takes a village. And if you are on the other side, where you need a village, and you've been avoiding it, you don't talk about it, you don't want to share with your life group what you're going through, maybe you just give little, surface level information, but you're really struggling and your marriage is really struggling, I want to encourage you to find your community. Find your people, because we weren't made to do this without them. I'd like to close and give you some resources. The first of which is a really interesting book that was written by Jim and Leah Stout. What I really love about this book is that it is from the perspective of both a mentally ill husband and his wife. They chronicle and talk about their struggles, some of the difficulties that they had in their communities, in their relationship, in their lives. And they also share some stories of other people and their journeys through mental illness. I think this is beautiful because so often when we're in this island by ourselves where we're struggling with mental illness in our families, we feel like there might not be anybody else who really gets it. And so the reason I'm recommending this is because these people get it. They've been there, they've experienced it, and they have a really beautiful story to share on how they stayed married even when they didn't think they could make it. I want to talk about community supports. So, if you're on the more distress level in your marriage and you just kind of need a little bit, I think we all kind of stay there on some level all the time, but sometimes it's worse than others. But we need our community. And some of the best resources that we have for that are community groups, life groups. These are people that are meant to do life with you, to talk about hard things, to share things with, and to experience joys and sorrows. And I encourage you, if you go to Crosspoint or if you go to a different church, there are churches all over the nation, because I recognize some of you may not even be from Pearland. We have a following that extends beyond just our own little city. I encourage you to find a life group, a community, wherever it is that you live, that can support you and walk with you, and you can walk with them. Mentorships. Identifying people in your life who have gone through things before you, who have the ability to walk alongside with you and shepherd you through these difficult times in your life. I think this is great no matter what. Actually, preventatively, I think we should all have mentorships in our lives where we can connect with people who can guide us and keep us accountable in our marriages, which might help prevent some of the harder things from happening. Also, Celebrate Recovery. Celebrate Recovery, that is something that's also offered all over the United States, but we do offer it here at Crosspoint. It is a specific program that is meant to tackle hurts, habits, and hang-ups. We don't all always have an issue with alcohol or drugs or sex, but we might have a hurt or a hang-up, or we might be struggling to grapple with the hurt that we've experienced in our marriage. Celebrate Recovery is an incredibly safe place to get with a community of other people who are sitting where you're sitting and can see things from your perspective. And I encourage mightily that you look into that if it's something that seems appropriate for you. Next, I want to talk about clinical supports. So this is where, we're more in the conflictual marriage stage, where we recognize that there are some more significant issues. Maybe you've tried everything, you've done it all yourself, but you realize even through this conversation that maybe you need a little bit more. This would be the resources that you have. So here in Pearland, we have a number of very qualified, excellent resources for mental health counseling for families, marriages. There's several I've listed here. Counseling Connections for Change in particular, they offer free and reduced rate services. So even if you are in a financial situation that you're like, I don't have insurance or I can't afford this, I want you to know that God has provision for you. This is a Christian organization that has developed a program just for you so that you don't have to miss out on opportunities. We also have Pearland Counseling Center and Blue Flame Psychotherapy Services here in town, and there are many others. So get on Psychology Today. Look for a qualified professional who can come alongside you and your spouse or your future spouse. Even maybe you're not even married yet, or maybe you're struggling and you're not even dating anyone. Look for a qualified professional who can help support you wherever it is that you live. There is somebody there. Also, the Menninger Clinic. Menninger Clinic we're very lucky. We actually have access to a complex mental illness clinic here in the Houston area. They're out of Baylor University, and they have an incredible, incredible program for assessments and for supports for families and couples who are struggling with mental illness, and they are an incredible resource. So now we can all take a deep breath. I've shared all of these hard things, but I'm also hoping that we can see this as an opportunity. We can either take this information and we just can kind of put it away in a drawer, but we can also choose to leave it out and start a conversation with our spouse, with our community, with our friends, with our family, and not allow it to continue to be something that we're afraid of. We're in a church setting, and even in a church setting where Christ is present, we oftentimes neglect to talk about this. And so I'm hopeful that you will have gotten some useful information today, and that you will seek the help that you need if you need it. I am so appreciative of your time. Thank you so much.